Good morning and welcome to your morning report for Tuesday, 18 March 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike this morning. Let's get started with Inside the Beltway. First, the acting U.S. Attorney Ed Martin has launched what he's calling the Special Unit Election Accountability, or SUEA. He said this unit has already launched its first investigation, and the intent is to ensure that election laws are obeyed nationwide. And Ed Martin has been a long-time critic of U.S. elections and some of the potential election fraud that's happened in the past few elections. Also, the U.S. Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, who's a former aide to Robert Lighthizer, who was the U.S. Trade Representative under Trump's first administration, said, according to people familiar with the matter, is attempting to take control of the planned 2nd April announcement on new tariffs. And these tariffs are supposed to include tariffs on automotive parts and finished vehicle imports, pharmaceutical imports, semiconductors, and metal imports. And people familiar with the matter said that Greer's planning to reinstate a public comment period on these tariffs, which could delay these tariffs past the 2nd of April. And moving on to the next slide, we are seeing more developments in this fight between the Washington, D.C. District Court and the Trump administration. Yesterday, James Boasberg, who is the D.C. District Judge in this case, ordered the Department of Justice to provide information about deportation flights under the Enemy Aliens Act by noon today. During a hearing yesterday, the DOJ's lawyer, as far as I've seen, refused to provide information on how many people were actually deported in flights over the weekend. And the Department of Justice also asked the Washington, D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals to reassign this case to a different district court judge, because they said that what Boasberg has done over the weekend and yesterday was, quote, highly unusual and improper procedures. And I think this lawsuit could be the case that pushes the Trump administration to openly defy the courts if some of these other off-ramps we've talked about are closed. And this includes not only this appeal to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals to try to reassign this case, but also last week's emergency appeal by the Trump administration to the Supreme Court, because they're trying to get the Supreme Court to curtail these district judge nationwide injunctions. And I've seen legal analysts, multiple legal experts say that the birthright citizenship lawsuit that is actually part of that emergency appeal is the best case for the Trump administration to get a favorable decision from the Supreme Court on these nationwide injunctions. And so far, other Trump figures like Tom Homan, who's the immigration or border czar, has said that these deportations are going to continue. I've also seen news that something like 700,000 deportation warrants were issued yesterday. So I think that we're seeing, as we see more developments in this case, the next hearing is scheduled for Friday. We could see the Trump administration defy the district court in this situation. Moving on to our roll-ups. Kathy Hochul, New York governor, has asked the Trump administration to take the lead on encouraging AI development and developing energy capacity. And this is in response to a Trump administration request for comments on these two policy areas from the states. And New York was actually the first state to send in a response to this request. And in the Hochul statement, they're saying that nuclear power should be considered a viable long-term solution to meet growing energy demand. And so I expect that Hochul is sort of the first mover on some of these blue states, especially in the Northeast, to work with the Trump administration on energy development, which I think also bodes well for that Northeast energy pipeline. And then some states that include Connecticut, Oregon, Utah, Iowa, and Montana are considering bills to expand state consumer data privacy laws. Looking into some of the bills that are being considered in these state legislatures, they're mostly trying to expand the coverage of consumer data protection to nonprofits and expanding what data is covered, including health data, and also imposing fees on companies depending on how much of their yearly revenue is based on selling consumer data to data brokers. And then next, the U.S. births, according to the National Center for Health Statistics, have declined in 2023 to the lowest level in 4 decades. And according to this report, the U.S. total fertility rate is 1.6, and they said that there has been a 2% annual decline in the U.S. birth rate since 2008. This is something that's actually happening globally, and I have seen, there's a lot of push to make up for falling birth rates with immigration, and a lot of people I've seen trying to point to one factor or the other as the single point for this fertility rate decline that we've started to see. Even I think in some parts of Africa have also started to see declining birth rates and negative fertility. But this is a complex issue with multiple moving parts, and I'm interested to see what kind of moves the Trump administration makes to try to reverse this. Because I remember during the 2024 campaign, Vice President J.D. Vance actually brought up some policies that have been implemented that likely have had an effect on declining birth rates in the U.S. And then finally, on the domestic side, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol said it awarded the first border wall construction contract under the new Trump administration. And this is to build 7 miles of border wall in the Rio Grande Valley sector. And Customs and Border Patrol said the new construction is going to close critical openings in the border wall that were left incomplete due to contract cancellations by the Biden administration. And Jared, if you can come on and go through your roll-up items, please.
Absolutely. Yesterday, President Trump posted on social media that Iran would be responsible for the entire Houthi operation, including funding, material support, and military intelligence. And to that end, President Trump said that every shot fired would be attributed to Iran directly. Now, this is likely, I think, a hardline negotiating tactic similar to escalate to de-escalate. And actually, you and I were talking about this post-show yesterday about how, when the U.S. really focuses on Iran, it doesn't go well for Iran. Now, this could be used to get Iran to back its proxies off and capitulate a little bit on the potential nuclear deal. That way, the U.S. can properly focus on a pivot to Asia.
Yeah, when on our discussion yesterday, actually, I think it was you that pointed out that it would be pretty effective to directly tell Iran that we are trying to pivot to China containment. That seems to be the pretty strong sentiment of the entire Trump administration, not just Elbridge Colby, who has probably been most influential on that. But do you think that will be do you think that will actually be effective in getting this, getting Iran to kind of simmer down and pull back their proxies in Yemen?
I think it can be to a certain degree. We do have to remember that proxies are still proxies. They're not direct arms. So Iran easily could just lose control of them. But any kind of material or immaterial support, such as intelligence support, could be cut off, and that makes them considerably less effective. And then Iran would be holding up their end of the deal, and whatever happens to the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, happens. And actually, on the note of Hamas, Israel ended the ceasefire with Hamas last night with airstrikes into Gaza after accusing Hamas of not releasing hostages. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, released an interim report yesterday to adjust for President Trump's tariff threats. Now, the OECD expects Mexico to have a 1.3% economic contraction this year due to these tariffs, with a majority of that being owed to only a 10% tariff increase with the United States. So the blanket 25% threat, it would actually cause a significantly more damage to their economy. Further, they expect Mexico to have a 4.4% inflation rate through 2025 at the same time that they're expecting the economic contraction. And the last two kind of go hand in hand here. President Trump and President Putin are scheduled to hold their call on the ceasefire today right about now, and potentially up to 11 o'clock. President Putin will reportedly request the U.S. to cease all weapons deliveries to Ukraine during the ceasefire. And I think the Russians are coming into this fairly optimistically, because at the same time, Russia's finance minister announced that he's going to reprivatize the numerous national level companies that the Russian government seized at the beginning of the Ukraine war. And that strongly signals to me that they expect a ceasefire to come about in the very near future, if not immediately after the call.
Yeah, we were talking about this before the show, and this was extremely interesting to me because this is, like you said, a major signal that the Russian government expects some type of movement on a peace deal or something, because just generally a state, if we put on my John Mearsheimer thinking cap, a state generally takes actions based on how secure it feels, right? States are security seeking. In this case, basically revving down or ramping down their wartime economy seems like a major signal that they're feeling more secure now as far as a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine and some kind of détente with NATO and the US than they were previously. And I think this bodes well for the Trump administration, making a deal here.
Absolutely.
All right, moving on to our warning items for today. First, we're going to talk about the Alaska Energy Hub and state-run Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation. Officials said they're traveling to Japan and South Korea to court investments for this Alaska natural gas development plan. And Japan Ambassador nominee George Glass said at a recent confirmation hearing that he's going to hold Japan to its commitment to reducing both its trade deficit with the U.S. and reliance on Russian natural gas by purchasing U.S. natural gas through this Alaska Energy Hub. And the Trump administration is pushing for significant gas energy development in the U.S. during campaign. We saw a lot of talk, especially from J.D. Vance, about this idea of a Saudi Arabia of natural gas and how the U.S. could have natural gas dominance. I think we also reported on last week Bloomberg economics analysis showing that if we continue on this path and the Trump administration is successful in these energy policies, it was something like 1 in 3 tankers globally would have by 2030 American gas on them. And I think this is important because this is going to lower domestic energy prices while curtailing Russian gas export to key allies, because this energy hub is supposed to bolster the Pacific Anti-Coalition ahead of the Trump administration's major pivot to China containment. And actually, before the show, Jared and I were discussing this as well, if you come on, Jared.
Yep.
And this seems to me like if Japan is dependent currently on Russian gas, that they're likely to support this energy hub, and we could see them, engage in this foreign direct investment the Trump administration is trying to get, because there is a historical, parallel here, because Japan is not an energy producing company or a country.
Absolutely. So in the lead up to the Pearl Harbor attack, about 4 months prior, America had, enacted an oil embargo on Japan, and not being an energy producing country in any capacity, that really hindered their ability to do basically anything. And that they feel that forced them into a war they knew they would lose against the United States, hence the surprise attack against Pearl Harbor in December of 41. So I think what Japan is doing here, they're looking at the Alaska hub as an opportunity to avoid a repeat of that with Russia, who has signaled, A, we are technically still at war from that 80 years ago, and B, we still have some of the territory right above you that you don't want, or you're trying to claim and we're trying to claim, and that's an issue. At the same time, as we covered yesterday, Vladivostok sits right in the Sea of Japan and can tie up a ton of Japan's resources. So it could force Japan's hand into dealing with the Russian Pacific Fleet, if Russia were to cut off the liquid natural gas.
Well, the one thing, so because Japan's not an oil producing company, I remember, I think we talked about when this ESG pushback started, I think earlier this year, Japan's sovereign wealth fund actually is under management of one of these fund managers that is was a part of the Net Zero Fund Management Alliance. And if Japan is really going to get behind this, I'm kind of looking out to see where their sovereign wealth fund goes as far as pushing ESG, because they're one of those funds that are one of those funds that has provided money for the big ESG push, during the Biden administration and Obama administration. But if we do see a movement on this, that could be a significant boost to this Alaska energy hub. But I think also a signal that, like you said, Japan is worried about Russia cutting off energy to them, because it doesn't necessarily mean that Russia would join a war if we did have a conflict or crisis with China and our coalition in the region. It could just be Russia says they don't want to get involved because, like I think you said before the show, they do have a border with China, and historically they have had some enmity with China, especially over border issues.
Yes. So we've talked quite a bit about the American foreign policy establishment trying to potentially weaken the no limits friendship between Russia and China, and with the intent of preventing Russia from militarily engaging in a Pacific war if such a thing should come about. Now, Russia would still be very cozy with China. I don't think it's quite in the realm of possibility to say that we could peel them entirely off. But yes, Russia does have an outstanding territorial dispute with China. They've signaled publicly that it's not, but China still views it as an issue. And at the same time, they do border with China. They do, a ton of trade with China. They still operate very closely with them. They could be obligated to just go, well, Japan, you are at war with the Chinese, our friends. We're not going to supply you to hurt our friends. That's not an action that's not a military action. That is simply just, basic foreign policy. You reward your friends, and if you have somebody that's in a fight with your friend, you don't reward them.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. If you could stay on, let's move on to your warning item for today. And we're going to stay in the Pacific in this case, and we're talking about the Marine Corps pre-staging equipment.
Yes, the Marine Corps is returning to Subic Bay. Now, Subic Bay is over in the Philippines. You can see it center of the map there. This is to pre-stage equipment for disaster relief and humanitarian aid for the first time in 32 years. I got to check the exact date. I think this is actually older than me at this point. Now, the commanding officer said that the site would house motor transportation, communication, and engineering equipment, but no munitions. And that's nominally true, but or at least it probably is true. However, the equipment fills a combat support role. All of this stuff is there to, yes, it can work for humanitarian aid, disaster relief, all of that, but also can support combat operations. And Subic Bay has a brand new Philippine Navy base, and it regularly hosts visiting forces from America, from Japan. I think the French were right up in there just not too long ago. And what this actually does in practice is establish a permanent supply chain in preparation for a potential war with China. It doesn't have to hold munitions. It just has to be a logistics hub, essentially, for the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I think this is actually a development going towards that whole pivot to the Pacific, because like you said, this is basically a dual use hub, right? This is the idea behind the National Guard, is that they engage, just as an aside, they engage in humanitarian and disaster relief, but that serves a training purpose for military operations, because you have all or most of the same logistics concerns. So this, to me, this looks like part of this buildup for this pivot to China containment, because like you said, while this doesn't have munitions actually located at this re-established hub, this does point to building a supply chain for this potential crisis or conflict with China.
Yep.
All right. Well, we have time for some questions and answers. I see the first one from Bad Wabbit. Speaking of ships, tankers, and shipping, has anything come from Trump's directive of building more ships? Is there a status update on that? I think it's probably too soon to see a whole lot of development on that. But I have seen, I think we even reported on it a couple of weeks ago, there are international shipping companies that are basically signaling that they're under pressure from what the Trump administration is proposing. One of those things being that $1 million per port entry for Chinese-built ships and certain, I think, Chinese flagships. And because that's not per entry into U.S. territorial waters, it's per port entry. Every time that one ship enters a port, they have to pay $1 million fee. They're proposing that, and they are putting pressure on some of these companies to start increasing the amount of U.S. built ships that they have in their fleets, which I think in the medium and long term will or should help reinvigorate the U.S. shipbuilding industry. But I think they're running into some of the same problems, because I read a lot of John Conrad stuff. He's he founded G Captain, which is focused on shipping logistics developments, and my impression is that the shipbuilding industry in the U.S. is running into a lot of the same problems that defense industrial people are saying. Is that like there's supply chain issues because everything's reliant on the just-in-time logistics. There's skilled labor issues, which there's not enough money to pay skilled laborers to work at these shipyards. And I think part of that is that I remember, I think, reading a while ago that at one point in time, the shipbuilding, like the shipyards, brought in management consultants who basically told them to lay off their expensive skilled labor. I think a few years ago. So I'm keeping an eye out for how that goes, but I don't expect any developments in the short term just because of how long the timeline will be for these shipyards to ramp up.
I'm glad you ended there. That's right where I wanted to pick up. What we're talking about here is not a small endeavor, and I think everybody's kind of used to the just-in-time logistics, as you said. But when you make big moves like this, it takes a long time to move. It's kind of just a typology for inertia. When you're talking about China producing, or really in World War II, it was one ship every 3 days, one ship every 5 days, something like that. You don't actually produce a ship every 5 days. You finish a ship every couple of days through numerous assembly lines. That takes time. Those assembly lines are what really take the time to build back up. And then from there, you can rapidly build up. And in addition to that, as you mentioned, there are the port fees issues. We talked a little bit about the Hong Konger trading companies looking to reflag. All of those are opportunities to rapidly rebuild without having to rebuild a true assembly chain right off the bat. Now, that obviously there are a lot of cons that go along with that, no pun intended. That's there. It can be doable, but it absolutely needs to be taken on an appropriate time scale. We're probably looking at a 1 to 2 year time scale at a bare minimum to even begin this effort. Anything less than like 10 years, I would say, is an impressive feat.
Yeah, I think the historical analog here is, for lack of a better one, World War II. Like, people talk about ramping up defense industry production, but the one ship every 3 days did not start in 1941. As far as I understand, a lot of that production actually started at least 7 years earlier. So we were, for 7 years before we entered World War II, we were ramping up production of ships and tanks and planes. So yeah, this is a pretty long timeline. I think with modern technology, it may not be 7 years, it may be shorter, but it's definitely on a year timeline, not a month or day timeline. Our next question from Bad Wabbit as well. Russian oil in Japan. Russia has never stopped the oil and transport, even through Ukraine. They did not blow up the pipelines. And to my knowledge, they have never threatened to do so. So why the analysis they might?
So when looking at the European theater, it's pretty much a Russian-only decision there to whether or not to continue the oil flow. And they can create a dependency on the people who would primarily be assisting their main enemy there, Ukraine. In the Pacific theater, it's not just Russia that gets to make that decision. In fact, they're the junior partner to China. So they could have an obligation to China to undercut the Japanese war effort. And liquid natural gas basically runs, a modern civilization. If you cut that off, it's very hard to heat, particularly for somebody like Japan, who has to import everything. So
I think it's also important to point out, foreign policy is, a lot of foreign policy and grand strategy is working in an information deficient environment. So Russia may not do that, but it's Japan's perception that Russia could disrupt Japanese energy supplies that's important to that rather than Russia saying they would do it.
That is a great thing to bring up. This is primarily Japan being worried about the possibility rather than whether or not Russia would actually do it. Because if you can take that off the table, you don't have to worry about it. All right.
All right. If you could round up any more questions. What is the flag behind you? That is the Revolutionary War era Appeal to Heaven pine tree flag. Let's see. For Bad Wabbit, so 10 years. If they are now stating war with China in 2027, we don't have 10 years. Well, I think Jared's analysis on this has been very on point as far as the timeline is that developments have pushed that either back or it definitely not in 20, at least according to Jared's analysis, definitely not in 2027.
Yeah, I don't think. Okay, so the stated goal of China is to be militarily prepared to invade Taiwan in 2027. That is not Xi saying we're going to do it in 2027. He is leaving it open-ended, but they want to have a military preparedness. I don't think they're going to even achieve that, so I don't think the possibility is there. That I cannot read minds. If China believes they are militarily prepared to invade Taiwan, they could still do it. That does not mean they would win, though. And that significantly changes the calculus on deterrence, quite frankly, is if they believe that they can do it and they go for it and everybody else thinks, well, no, you cannot do it due to the strength of a coalition, because keeping in mind, it's not just China versus Taiwan or China versus Taiwan, the U.S. It's China versus Taiwan, the U.S., Japan, Philippines, South Korea, potentially Vietnam. They're looking a lot more likely, probably a lot of the European powers. And that's just talking militarily, not even economically. And there are economic backups to go along with it. It would, I think we may have a bit more than 10 years. But in addition to that, I don't think we're ever going to hear a government official say that we are not going to have to prepare for 2027, because that takes the pressure off.
Exactly. That's exactly what I think that part of this hammering on the 2027 date is to get some momentum on reindustrializing the defense industrial base, because these contractors have pointed out some of the problems can be, I think, solved by the Trump administration pretty well, maybe not easily, but they're very relatively simple solutions. One of them being they're saying they want longer contracts, defense contracts for like munitions production, because they don't want to invest all this capital if a year later they're going to get the rug pulled out from under them. And that's something the Trump administration, I think the Department of Defense could do, is, without any kind of congressional authority necessary, to just extend the timeline of some of these contracts. But like you said, saying, oh, well, 2027 is no longer a concern, does take pressure off of the Trump administration and the Department of Defense to look for these solutions.
Absolutely. Well, that is the end of the questions.
All right. Well, if that is the last question of the day, that will end your morning briefing for today. We'll be back with you tomorrow at 08 Central. Be safe and stay out front.